being independent is supposed to be a good thing, right? But when does it go too far? What if it actually pushes people away? Maybe you're someone who handles everything alone, doesn't ask for help, prides yourself on staying strong. But here's the real question. How much is too much? Let's talk about 5 traits that might feel like strengths, but without us even noticing, can push people away. By the end of this video, you will be able to recognize when your independence turns dark. Let me ask you something. How often do you struggle alone, telling yourself, I don't need help, I don't need anyone? For some, asking for help isn't an option, not because they don't need it, but because admitting they do feels impossible. Carrying the weight alone becomes this quiet, twisted badge of honor, a silent way of saying, I'm strong. But here's the truth. Silent suffering, it doesn't build strength, it creates distance. The people around can't see the struggle because it's kept hidden, locked away. And slowly that silence becomes a barrier. Connections fade, not because people don't care, but because they never knew what was really going on. Bit by bit, that choice to struggle alone becomes a wall, cutting off the very support that could make things easier. Emotions. Don't you feel like they're just messy? Like letting people in on what you're really feeling is risky? Sometimes this need to hold back goes way back to moments when showing emotion was met with indifference, maybe even rejection. So keeping it all at arm's length starts to feel safer, almost like control. Vulnerability becomes optional, or maybe even something to avoid. But here's the reality. While it might feel like staying composed, to everyone else, it can feel distant, even detached. People around start to sense that barrier, that closed door. They stop trying to guess what's going on. Emotional minimalism might feel like protection, but it slowly creates distance, leaving others outside. Bit by bit, this habit of holding back becomes its own form of isolation. Not because people don't care, but because they're never fully let in. How often do you think, if you want something done right, you just have to do it yourself? No one else can meet your standards. No one else handles things quite the way you would. For some, this sense of needing to take charge becomes a constant pattern. Every responsibility, every task, it all falls on their shoulders because letting go feels like a risk they can't afford to take. Relying on someone else starts to seem like a gamble, so they step in, time and time again, even when it's overwhelming. And here's what happens. Each day becomes a battle with no backup. They carry the load alone, trying to control every detail, rarely allowing anyone else to step in. People might see them as incredibly capable, maybe even a bit of a powerhouse. But they might also see them as untouchable, maybe even a bit intimidating. Over time, this hero complex leads to a kind of quiet isolation. It creates this feeling of being in it alone, a self-imposed rule that it's always me against the world. What was meant to be empowering becomes exhausting, creating a wall that keeps others at a distance. And in the end, this kind of independence, it doesn't bring freedom. It just builds a fortress around the one carrying it all. Are you one of those who believe that people are either fully in or not worth the risk at all? Like if someone doesn't meet your standards 100%, it's easier to keep them at a distance? This way of seeing things creates a strict divide, no middle ground, no room for mistakes. People become either rock solid or a potential disappointment. And if a letdown happens, stepping back feels safer, like a kind of protection. But over time, holding everyone to a standard of perfection becomes impossible. Friends, family, partners all eventually fall short in some way because that's part of being human. And as more people are kept at a distance, the circle starts to shrink. Bit by bit, this all-or-nothing mindset gradually closes off the world, leaving fewer and fewer connections. What begins as a way to avoid disappointment ends up limiting real connection, leaving behind a sense of isolation instead of security. All right, here's where hyper-independence hits hardest. After all that silent suffering, the emotional minimalism, the hero complex, the all-or-nothing thinking, it becomes second nature to stay on guard. Defense mode becomes the default, especially in relationships. This often looks like keeping a safe distance, avoiding getting too close, convincing oneself that emotional intimacy isn't really necessary. It can feel like being wired this way, like a form of control. But underneath, it's a pattern of self-protection, where closeness is treated as a risk. Even with someone who truly cares, there's always a barrier, a subtle guardedness that can be felt, even if unspoken. And this isn't limited to romantic relationships. It spills over into friendships, family connections, and every close bond. Over time, there's less leaning on others, less openness, a gradual retreat inward. It becomes like a cage of self-reliance, where the support and connection of others remain just out of reach, even from those who would readily be there in times of need. This is the hidden cost. Extreme independence fosters an illusion of strength and invulnerability. But it also keeps real connection at arm's length. In the end, the strength that once felt empowering may become the quiet reason for a deep sense of loneliness.